So, at a symposium on anthropology and the paranormal held at the Esalen Institute in October 2013, the folklorist David J. Hopkins argued that for many in Western academia, the belief in spirits is the cut-off point between the primitive and the modern. So his paper explored the processes of disenchantment that have gradually overcome Western academic thinking since the Enlightenment, and highlighted some of the problems that contemporary encounters with ostensible spiritual beings pose for the dominant framework of Western rationalist materialism, which actively constructs itself in opposition to the spiritual, supernatural, irrational. In this respect, Hufford argues, encounters with spirits, psychedelic or otherwise, represent a significant problem for Western academia's dominant paradigm. In other words, how do we explain spirit experiences when the objects of such experiences, spirits, cannot exist? So this paper will survey a variety of different approaches to the problem of spirits from within anthropology, which is my main disciplinary background, ranging from those that effectively explain them away to those that fully embrace spiritual realities. In presenting these diverse perspectives, it's hoped that further interesting directions for possible research will suggest themselves. So the speculations and explorations that I'm going to be talking about are founded on my own encounters with spirits, firstly in a psychedelic state, and secondly in the context of spiritualist trance mediumship, which is what my PhD research is on. But before we go any further, it's important we pause to take a brief note on terminology. So the term spirits is particularly broad, and it's used to refer to a wide variety of non-physical entities, ranging from the spirits of the dead, as the spirits I encountered in Bristol claim to be, to nature spirits, ancestors, and even things like saints, angels, demons, different kinds of deities, and there's lots of other different kinds of forms and types. But in the context of this presentation, the terms spirits and spiritual beings will continue to be used in this broad and inclusive way, primarily because many of the same conceptual problems arise whether we're talking about the spirits of the dead in suburban Bristol, encounters with luminous entities in the desert, meetings with the dragon in solitary contemplative practice, possession by the lower in voodoo, conversations with God in evangelical Christianity, and encounters with thousand-eyed creatures on DMT. Or, in my own experience, an encounter with the Psilocybe folk under the influence of magic mushrooms. So it's undoubtedly important to be aware of this broadness of terminology, but for the limited purposes of this paper, which is only really a kind of brief overview, the term spirits and spiritual beings works quite well. Okay, so this is the very first time I took Liberty Cat mushrooms. They were freshly picked from the mountains in Wales where I live, and it was just on the night before my English GCSE. So yeah, it was quite it was a good thing. And as I studied the shifting landscapes of that strange place, my perception was inundated with spiraling earthy forms and twisting geometric motifs that faded in and out of my consciousness. But the strangest thing I saw on that weird night was a procession of small, two-dimensional, goblin-like creatures in the grain of a wooden chest of drawers. So they were dark and organic, with pointed noses and elfin ears. And at the time I called them fairies. I was like, oh, God, fairies. And I think these images from Brian Froud capture some of the essence of their appearance. In the midst of the whirling, impersonal fractal chaos, these entities seemed to be moving along the grain of the wood with deliberate intent. The creatures regarded me with indifference when they noticed that I was staring and continued on with their procession. So I noticed them, they kind of clocked me, and then they were just like, oh, we're going to carry on with our journey. But their apparent agency differentiated them from the seething psychedelic patterns that surrounded them, and suggested that they were something more than simple hallucinations. But if they were not simple hallucinations, then what were they? So encounters with apparently sentient entities under the influence of psychoactive substances are well documented in the psychedelic literature. And just a few examples, we've got Terence McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson and David Luke with his thousand-eyed creatures. And countless people have also recorded experiences of sort of like distinctively feminine presences with salvia and things like that. And incidentally, one of my friends had this crazy salvia experience that was a bit like Hellraiser. And he was being ripped apart with all these chains and stuff. Really weird. Rick Strassman's book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, contains loads of these accounts. And this is just a very broad overview, and it's not even including any of the kind of traditional shamanic encounters with spirits. So, suffice to say, these things happen. But my interest in the nature of spirits was further piqued during a few years later, during my undergraduate study of a group of mediums in Bristol, trance mediums. And they later became the focus of my PhD research. And far from being abstractions only spoken about with little real-world relevance, the spirits I encountered at the Bristol Spirit Lodge were very tangible. They were manifested in three-dimensional space through the bodies of their entranced mediums. You could engage with them and interact with them. And each spirit presented itself physically and psychologically in a distinctive and surprisingly consistent manner across weeks, months, and even years of mediumship development. And through this process, they were able to build up a relationship with the sitters. Furthermore, these spirit entities apparently possessed some form of agency, in that they were clearly able to affect change in the world around them. This is an important point to bear in mind. And they were quite capable of influencing the actions and behaviours of the social circle that built up to support them. So in a sense, it could be argued that the spirit and the group were sort of mutually sustaining each other. So the Psilocybe folk showed their apparent agency and intention in their movements against the impersonal fractal flow of the psychedelic state. And the spirits of the Bristol Spirit Lodge revealed their agency through their capacity to influence and affect social reality. I'll just talk very briefly about these spirits at the Bristol Spirit Lodge. Each medium has a set group of spirits. It's usually between 1 and 16 spirits that come through. Got this little picture with all these spirits. And it's not like when you go to a spiritualist church and they say, I'm getting the F coming through. Can anyone recognise that F as someone who might be related to them? Possibly. These guys go into a trance and they bring through specific spirits every time. So you don't go there hoping to meet your dead ancestor, you go there to speak to these specific spirits who come through. And each of the spirits in the spirit team has a particular role. So one spirit might be working towards the development of ectoplasm, for instance, and others might be trying to levitate objects. So they have all of these different spirits. And one spirit in particular was a spirit by the name of Charlie. And he explained how Charlie wasn't his real name. He was actually some kind of like Chinese monk, but Charlie is a name that he uses so that he can kind of make himself kind of easily accessible to people. And he was quite impressive. And following the completion of my degree, I spent a lot of time transcribing his philosophical and spiritual reflections on the nature of reality. This little book. So just briefly to summarise my initial interest, I've been intrigued by the apparent immanence of the spirits I encountered in these seances. They were not lofty abstractions but tangible realities, talking to us directly from the corner of the room we were sitting in. And secondly, I was impressed by the apparent complexity of their personalities, but not in all cases. And thirdly, I realised that at the very least the spirits I encountered were socially real. And in fact, they were the main characters in an ongoing discourse between the living and the dead. It was these peculiarities of what I'd witnessed in this garden shed in Bristol, combined with my experience of the seemingly purposive behaviour of the Psilocybe folk on magic mushrooms, that spurred me to investigate further down the rabbit hole of the paranormal. And that's kind of where I am now. Stuck in there. So now what I want to do very quickly is just go through some of these different kind of dominant approaches in anthropology. So the first two theoretical approaches I want to discuss are actually amongst the oldest, and they're the intellectualist approaches, and which were kind of pioneered by the earliest anthropologists, and the cognitive approach, which might be thought of as a slightly modified descendant of the intellectualist tradition. So both of these approaches can be classed as reductive in that they collapse spirit beliefs and experiences down to underlying psychological and cognitive processes. So Tyler's theory of animism is usually a good starting point. Tyler argued that animism, which he defined as the belief in spiritual beings, represents the core feature of religion in general. So belief in the existence of spiritual beings is the very essence of religion. We can put aside the problems that are associated with this definition of religion for the time being, and just focus on what's most important about Tyler's theory for us. So for Tyler, spirits are a theoretical postulate devised by what he terms primitive philosophers. First of all, to explain the difference between life and death. Secondly, to explain apparent encounters with people in dreams. And thirdly, to explain the seemingly conscious activities of natural phenomena, such as the wind, rivers, and lightning, and all that. All of this, Tyler reasoned, could be suitably explained by positing a non-physical spirit or soul that animates the physical world. So from this perspective, the belief in spiritual beings, and consequently all forms of religion, if we accept Tyler's definition, was entirely irrational and already superseded by positivist scientific materialism. So in Tyler's own terminology, religion and all of these encounters with spirits are little more than a survival, redundant in the modern world, like an evolutionary spam goal. So in many respects, Tyler's intellectualist theory is the predecessor of the cognitive theories of religion proposed by scholars such as Pascal Boyer, Stuart Guthrie, and Justin Barrett. So Guthrie's anthropomorphic theory of religion suggests that the belief in spirits emerges from our innate cognitive capacity to detect anthropomorphic features in the world around us. And the classic example being to see faces in the clouds or the face of Jesus in a piece of toast. And this is linked to the psychological phenomenon known as pareidolia, which is frequently invoked in discussions of ghostly encounters and apparitions. So from such experiences, it suggested that the existence of spirits more generally is postulated. Of course, according to this view, the spirits have no external reality beyond the perception of external objects and the misattribution of patterns and agency to chaotic systems like the weather. Arguing along similar lines and drawing on Guthrie's research, Justin Barrett's hyperactive agency detection theory for the origin of spiritual beings suggests that we've got an inbuilt cognitive propensity to detect predators in the environment, and this has led to the emergence of beliefs about what Barrett calls counterintuitive non-physical beings. So it's through the interactions of cognitive devices, it's got this kind of like computer analogy going on, such as these supernatural concepts are ultimately formed. So just as Tyler had implied that early human beings misunderstood the world around them by inferring the existence of spirits, so Guthrie and Barrett suggest that belief in spirits is dependent on cognitive misinterpretation, combined with a lack of scientific understanding about how the brain really works. In the words of Pascal Boyer, the belief in spirits is a mere consequence or side effect of having the brains that we have. So perhaps the Psilocybe folk I encountered were nothing more than my brain's attempts to structure and put order on my perceptions in the chaotic mushroom state. But neither Tyler nor the cognitive scientists that followed him take seriously the possibility that spirits might actually arise from kind of real, weird encounters, or at the very least, like real strange experiences. Their theories have been developed, in fact, as part of a process of desupernaturalization and disenchantment, or as part of a process of naturalizing the supernatural. Tyler and the cognitive scientists seek to explain the persistent and widespread belief in spiritual beings by recourse to cognitive and psychological processes, leaving no room for a kind of transcendent, ontologically distinct spirit reality. And this is strange because this is what our fieldwork informants actually suggest that mediumistic experiences reveal. But there is a non-reductive mirror image of this approach, first advocated by Andrew Lang in the 1800s. There he is. Lang was both an early anthropologist and folklorist and a psychical researcher, and he was the president of the Society for Psychical Research in 1911. And he saw clear parallels between the ethnographic literature on spirit beliefs and the psychical research literature on the contemporary paranormal. He proposed this notion of comparative psychical research in order to bring these two disciplines together and put forward the suggestion that all manner of religious and paranormal beliefs might actually have their origins in genuine anomalous experiences, real or imagined. So this idea is basically an form of what David Hufford has called the experiential source hypothesis. From this perspective then, rather than being the product of misperception, misinterpretation and cognitive illusion, spirit beliefs might actually be rational interpretations of genuinely strange experiences. This hypothesis leaves open the possibility of real spirit beings, but it doesn't a priori assume or deny them. So perhaps my encounter with the Psilocybe folks was a real experience of something, and not simply the product of a cognitive category error, whatever that something might actually turn out to be in the long run. How am I doing for time?
You're doing all right, yeah.
Got loads to go. So we're going to move into thinking about just relativism very quickly. According to relativist approaches, the reality of spirits is understood to be socially and culturally determined. In other words, what's important is whether people within a given society actually believe in spirits or not. If they do, then the spirits are real within that particular cultural framework, and it's not the anthropologist's job to question their beliefs. And this idea has been summed up nicely by Evans Pritchard when he says, "As I understand the matter, there's no possibility of knowing whether the spiritual beings of primitive religions or if any others have any existence or not. And since that is the case, he cannot take the question into consideration." Sorry. What we have here then is a form of what's frequently called ontological bracketing, which has come to be recognized as the default position in the anthropology of religion. It doesn't matter whether the spirits are really real, what's important is that people believe them to be real. And of course this is true to a certain extent, and it enables scholars to bring the spirits into academic discourse without the need to enter into thorny debates about the reality or otherwise of the spirit beings. And there's a very good example of one of these bracketed approaches in the recent work of Niels Bobbant, an anthropologist, who's done field work in North Maluku with spirit mediums. And basically, in Maluku, the spirits still play an important role in contemporary political life, because when they have a difficult situation politically, they bring back the spirits to get their insights to help them make decisions. So again, the spirits have this kind of real world significance. And he says that spirits ought to be treated as methodologically real in the field setting, and that this allows us to get on with the process of studying what's going on socially. That's quite good to an extent. But despite the claim to neutrality in this kind of approach, the underlying paradigm in Western academia as a whole is nevertheless ontologically opposed to notions of magic, witchcraft and spirit beings, so that when such ethnographies enter into the wider scholarly discourse, they are often automatically understood in terms of belief rather than reality. The implication being that what they believe to be real isn't really real because our reality is the only really real reality. In other words, although the question of reality is bracketed out, we are nevertheless making an ontological assumption when we decide at what point to begin our bracketing exercise. By putting in brackets in the first place, we are announcing that this aspect of the culture can be studied and described in accordance with dominant paradigms, and this other aspect has to be left alone. So they're not really getting us anywhere. But there's also a kind of middle ground approach to the problem of spirits. So, for example, Michael Winkelmann's approach is an interesting one. Although he presents the case for understanding spirits as being shaped by the biological and cognitive structures of the brain and mind, much like the approach of the cognitive theorists discussed before, he nevertheless stresses the possibility of ontologically real spiritual beings, and that this continues to remain an open possibility. And he says that the notion that spirits reflect the structures of brain and mind is not to dismiss their ultimate ontological reality. Whatever may be out there as a foundation for spirits may exist independently of the brain and mind structure, but what we experience of the ultimate ontological reality is shaped by our brain and mind structures in ways that personify that unknown, rendering it human-like in its qualities. Does that make sense? In other words, there may well be ontologically distinct spirits existing somewhere out there, but just as with every other sensory experience, they must also be experienced through our biological, cognitive and cultural filters. In a sense, what Winkelmann's talking about here has some relevance to Carl Jung's notion of the psychoid. I like that word. A term that refers to the capacity of the Jungian archetypes, and I think the psyche more generally, to be simultaneously out there and in here. Jung conceived of the psychoid as the bridge from mind to matter in general, and the psychologist John Mills has referred to it as a liaison between mind and body. From this perspective then, spiritual beings, including possibly the Psilocybe folk I encountered, might be understood as a co-creation of internal biological, psychological and cultural influences interacting with ontologically distinct external stimuli, with spirits as we perceive and interact with them emerging at this intersection. Such an interpretation would account for both pan-cultural similarities, we have biological structures and ontologically distinct entities, as well as cross-cultural differences which should arise from the influence of our psychological and cultural filters. It could be that the entities encountered during psychedelic experiences partake of this psychoid nature, requiring our perception and engagement to become tangible, and yet also possessing an external and independent nature of their own. And this idea has popped up in a couple of other places. So in his discussion of spiritist psychic surgery in Brazil, anthropologist Sidney Greenfield, in an effort to understand the role of spirit beings in the process, he drew upon the writings of psychologist Lawrence Lachange, who put forward this third way in conceptualizing the nature of spirit controls. and trance mediumship. Lashan identified two dominant explanations for spirit controls, either that they're the product of multiple personality disorder or they are real spirits. Lashan suggests, however, a third way of thinking about these entities and proposes that they might best be understood as functional entities. And he says, functional entities do not have any length, breadth, or thickness. They cannot be detected by any form of instrumentation, although their effects often can be. They do not have continuous existence whether or not they are being mentally conceptualized. They exist only when they are held in the mind, only when being conceptualized, only when being considered to exist. So Lashan's hypothesizing was inspired by the famous trance medium Eileen J. Garrett's spirit-controlled Uvani. And other examples of functional entities include mathematical postulates, such as the mathematical square root, which not actually exist, but which are nevertheless real, in that they help us to solve real-life problems. And Greenfield summarizes this idea when he writes that a functional entity is what we agree it is and or does when it does it. In other words, a spirit is a spirit when it's being a spirit. And now we're going to move on a step further down the rabbit hole. So in a short but influential paper published in the journal Ontology of Consciousness in 1993, Edith Turner posed the important question, is the reality of spirits a tabooed or permitted field of study? She drew inspiration from her own first-hand encounters with the Ihamba spirit amongst the Ndembu in Zambia, and she called for a radical overhaul of anthropology's dominant framework for understanding the beliefs and experiences of research informants. She argued that anthropologists had tended to try to explain away elements of the cultures they studied that did not fit into the established and acceptable bounds of Western academia, and as such were failing to do what they set out to do in the first place, which was to understand an alternative worldview. In a later paper, Turner writes of the need to endorse the experiences of spirits as voracious aspects of the life world of the peoples with whom we work, that we faithfully attend to our own experiences in order to judge their veracity, that we are not reducing the phenomena of spirits or other extraordinary beings to something more abstract and distant in meaning, and that we accept the fact that spirits are ontologically real for those whom we study. And there have been some other more recent ethnographies that have tried to take these kinds of approaches. And let's move on quickly because we're running out of time. So the recent work of Tanya Luhrmann investigating the American evangelical Christian relationship with God also has relevance here. Luhrmann's research has focused on the processes by which evangelicals commune with God, specifically looking at prayer and the psychological phenomenon known as absorption. So she defines absorption as an individual's capacity to get lost in their own mental imagery. And Luhrmann suggests that those with high absorption are better able to develop this close relationship with God. It would be easy for Luhrmann to say that the experiences of communing with God is nothing more than imagination, nothing more than absorption, returning again to a reductive cognitive perspective. But Luhrmann doesn't quite go this far. Instead, she explores the possibility that the capacity to become absorbed in mental imagery is a precondition for the experience of God, who may or may not exist. And it's interesting to note here the similarity between the capacity to be absorbed in mental imagery and what happens in the psychedelic state, where mental imagery almost becomes primary. So in a similar way, I've suggested in my own work on spirit mediums that the conditions found in seances are specifically geared towards the facilitation of spirit encounters. Darkness is employed as a form of sensory deprivation, for example, music as a means to induce auditory stimulation. And both of these are used in the seances, and both of these are well-attested means of inducing altered states of consciousness, which in themselves are preconditions, or seem to be preconditions, for spirit contact. So this emphasis on altered states of consciousness also brings everything neatly in line with the psychedelic entity encounters. So perhaps, like the seance room, the intoxicated state is just one set of preconditions, neurochemical preconditions, that can facilitate contact with non-physical realities. I've got stuff about Frederick Myers and his idea of the superliminal and subliminal minds, which I won't go into, but they're cool. And Huxley and Bergson and their reducing valve, which is nice. So, in my own research, I've moved away from asking why questions, such as why do people believe in spirits, towards how questions, namely questions about the processes that might be involved. How do people communicate with spirits? The reason for this is twofold. Firstly, the question, why do people believe in spirits, can quite simply be answered with, because people have experiences that seem to suggest the presence of spirits. And I myself had an experience like this while participating in a mediumship development session when my left arm became possessed, and also my Psilocybe folk encounter. Secondly, asking how do people communicate with spirits presents researchers with the opportunity to engage with this subject area without the need to question the reality of spirits or impose our ethic interpretations on emic ontologies. In the words of parapsychological anthropologist Patrick Giesler, we can assume that spirits could exist and proceed ethically on that assumption. But I don't want this to sound like I'm kind of going back to this bracketing approach. And actually what I'm trying to suggest is kind of like the exact opposite of bracketing. And I want to draw a little bit from the work of Charles Fort. So he was famous in the early decades of the 20th century as a collector of anomalous and weird things, from like poltergeists and raining frogs and all that stuff. In order to accommodate these unusual phenomena, which he calls damned facts, because of their outright rejection by mainstream science, he developed this philosophy of intermediatism. And Fort defined intermediatism as a position in which nothing is real but nothing is unreal. All phenomena are approximations in one way between realness and unrealness. So in this characteristically playful way, Fort sought to deconstruct the rigid boundaries between the real and the unreal, and instead placed all phenomena from the mundane to the extraordinary on a sliding spectrum, where all things fluctuate between the real and the unreal. So from this perspective, nothing can be said to be entirely real or unreal. Everything is in flux. And that's another idea that I really like of this idea of possibilianism from the neuroscientist David Eagleman. And he says that he's trying to encourage scientists to be creative in scientific research, and he puts forward this idea of a possibility space, which is a frame of mind in which the researcher celebrates the vastness of our ignorance and is unwilling to commit to any particular made-up story, and takes pleasure in entertaining multiple hypotheses. So again, this playfulness in considering multiple possibilities is perfectly suited to the study of the paranormal, and it resonates well with Charles Fort's intermediatist philosophy. And then we can also move into other areas like Fiona Mowry's cognitive empathetic engagement. So very briefly, just to conclude, so I would suggest in the anthropological study of spiritual beings that it would be useful to employ an ethnographic approach that makes use of tools that destabilize ontological certainty, at least in the context of the ethnographic text, but also experientially in the field, and that this might lead to a more intellectually honest appreciation of the non-ordinary. In a sense, what I'm suggesting is an approach that is in many ways the opposite of the traditional bracketing approaches. Rather than bracketing out questions of ontology for fear that they might lead to truths or damned facts in Fort's terminology that cannot by their very nature fit into the established order of Western academia's dominant ontology, I suggest that we essentially open the floodgates of ontological possibilities. And this places all ontologies on an equal footing, so that while ontological bracketing protects and reinforces the mainstream consensus reality, what we might call ontological flooding destabilizes it and opens it up to questioning, exploration and expansion. In essence, such an approach places different ontological systems on an equally questionable footing. So this is also the place where we might want to look at parapsychology. And in answer to the question, do spirits exist, we could say possibly in more ways than one. Which is what William said before. The end.